It was a quiet Tuesday evening at Luna's Bistro, a small family-owned restaurant tucked away in the heart of the city. The evening shift had started a couple of hours ago, and the bistro was beginning to settle into a rhythm. The sound of sizzling, steaks on the grill, the clinking of glasses, and the low hum of conversations filled the air. For Greg, the owner, it was business as usual. He moved between the kitchen and the dining area, checking on the staff, ensuring orders were going out on time, and making sure everything was in order. Greg had always prided himself on the close-knit atmosphere of his restaurant. The employees were like family. He knew each of them well, especially Lila, the dishwasher, who had been working for him for almost 2 years. She was quiet and reserved, always showing up on time, never complaining. She had a hard-working nature, never asking for attention but consistently getting the job done. Greg had seen her grow in the job, from someone with little experience to someone who took pride in the cleanliness of the kitchen, handling the mountain of dirty dishes with precision and speed. But recently, something had changed. Small things had started to disappear. At first, it was insignificant, an extra spoon here, a forgotten napkin there. But over time, Greg began to notice a troubling trend. Items were vanishing from the kitchen, particularly things that weren't easy to replace. Expensive olive oil, some silver cutlery, and even a few plates from the restaurant's special collection had gone missing. He hadn't thought much of it initially, chalking it up to simple mistakes or maybe an oversight. But as the weeks passed, the losses became more frequent, and the weight of suspicion began to settle on his shoulders. Greg wasn't the type to point fingers without evidence, but he couldn't ignore the mounting feeling that something wasn't quite right. Lila had always been trustworthy, but now there was an unsettling shift in the air. He wasn't sure if his doubts were justified or if he was simply being paranoid, but every time he looked at Lila, he found himself wondering if she was hiding something. He had to admit there was something about her that seemed different lately. Her usually calm and efficient demeanor had begun to change. She seemed distracted, almost preoccupied, as though her mind was elsewhere. She still worked diligently, but Greg couldn't shake the feeling that she was avoiding him. Every time he caught her eye, she quickly looked away as if she was hiding something. Greg decided it was time to investigate. He couldn't keep running the business with this unease gnawing at him. If someone was stealing from his restaurant, he needed to know who it was and why. He had always treated his staff like family, but this was his livelihood at stake, and he couldn't afford to let it slide. He needed to confront the problem head-on, even if it meant risking the relationship he had with Lila. That evening, after the dinner rush, Greg made a decision. He would keep a closer eye on Lila. As the last of the customers left the bistro, he quietly slipped into the back kitchen, making sure to stay out of view. He watched her as she moved around the kitchen, scrubbing dishes and stacking them away. She worked silently, her eyes downcast as she focused on her task. But Greg couldn't help but notice how often she glanced toward the back door, almost nervously. After a few minutes, Greg made his way to the stockroom, pretending to check the inventory. He needed to observe Lila without her knowing. He wasn't sure what he was looking for, but he had a feeling that whatever it was, he would find it tonight. As he listened to the faint sounds of Lila's movements, he recalled all the things he had noticed. The way she was always carrying that small, worn bag with her, never leaving it unattended. It seemed odd to him, and the more he thought about it, the more it seemed like she was hiding something. He had never paid much attention to the bag before, but now it seemed like the key to solving the mystery. If she had something to hide, it was probably in that bag. Greg decided to follow his gut. As the kitchen emptied, he quietly moved back, toward the dishwashing area. Lila was finishing up, and the restaurant was winding down for the night. He waited until she was distracted, then quietly approached her. "Lila," he said, his voice low but firm. "Can I talk to you for a moment?" Lila looked up in surprise, her face a mixture of confusion and caution. "Of course, Greg. What's wrong?" Greg hesitated for a moment. The words stuck in his throat. But this was something he needed to do. He couldn't keep letting his suspicions grow without confronting the issue directly. "I've noticed some things going missing lately," he said, his eyes locking onto hers. "And I need to ask if you know anything about it." Lila's face faltered for a second, her eyes wide. She blinked and quickly looked away, as though trying to hide her nervousness. "What things?" she asked, her voice softer now. "Some kitchen supplies. Expensive things," Greg replied. "It's been happening for a while now. I just want to know if you've seen anything unusual." Lila stiffened, but she didn't say anything immediately. Her hands trembled slightly as she set down a dish she had been washing. Greg could see the hesitation in her face, and that was when he made the decision. He wasn't going to let this go any longer. He needed to know the truth, no matter how hard it was to face. "Lila, I'm going to have to ask you to let me check your bag," Greg said, his voice steady but his heart racing. Lila's expression darkened. Her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and anger. She didn't move for a moment, as if she were weighing the decision in her mind. But slowly she nodded, resigned. "Okay," she said softly, her voice barely audible. Greg's hand shook as he reached for the bag she had been carrying. He opened it, unsure of what he would find, but certain that whatever it was would change everything. The kitchen lights flickered, slightly as the last of the evening's dishes clinked softly in the sink. The bistro's usual hum of activity had long since faded, and the silence left behind felt heavy. Greg stood in the quiet corner, his mind racing with 1,000 thoughts, each one louder than the last. His gaze lingered on Lila as she moved about, rinsing the final set of plates. She was still the same, focused, efficient, but with an air of nervousness that Greg couldn't ignore. Her hands moved quickly, but her eyes, though focused on the task, seemed to dart away from time to time. Greg's heart pounded in his chest. Every second felt like an eternity, as the weight of the moment pressed down on him. He had suspected something for weeks, but now that the confrontation was imminent, the reality felt daunting. His mind was filled with conflicting emotions, anger, doubt, and an overwhelming sense of betrayal. Lila had been such a trusted part of the team. How could this be happening? He had no choice but to confront her. He couldn't run the business with this uncertainty looming over him. If someone was stealing from his restaurant, it needed to be dealt with immediately, no matter who it was. Even if it meant losing someone he had considered reliable after. A deep breath, Greg decided to approach her. The gentle clatter of dishes came to a stop as Lila set the last plate on the drying rack. Her back was to him. He had only a few seconds to make his decision. His stomach twisted, but there was no going back now. He stepped toward her, clearing his throat as he did. "Lila," he called out, his voice firm but controlled. though he could feel his pulse quicken. She turned at the sound of his voice, her face a mask of mild confusion. The ever so slight pause in her movement only deepened his growing suspicion. "Can we talk for a moment?" Greg continued, trying to keep his tone even. Lila nodded without speaking, her eyes still unsure but calm. She wiped her hands on a rag and turned to face him fully. Her body language was tense, her shoulders stiff, and there was an almost imperceptible tremble in her hands. Greg couldn't ignore that she looked uncomfortable, but he pushed the thought aside. This had to happen. "I've been noticing something strange lately," Greg said, his words measured, trying to gauge her reaction. "Things have been disappearing from the kitchen, some items, things that can't just be lost." He paused, watching for any change in her demeanor. Lila's face remained neutral, though Greg noticed the quick flicker of something in her eyes, something that almost looked like fear. "I need to know if you've seen anything unusual," Greg continued. "I want to trust you, Lila, but I can't ignore what's been happening." Lila didn't speak immediately. Instead, she lowered her gaze to the floor, avoiding Greg's eyes. It felt like an eternity passed as they stood in silence, the tension between them thickening with every second. Greg's heart sank. Her silence only confirmed the fear gnawing at him. Finally, Lila spoke, her voice soft but steady, though there was a noticeable crack in her words. "I didn't take anything, Greg." Her eyes lifted to meet his, but there was something in her gaze, something hesitant, unsure. "I wouldn't do that. You know me better than that." Greg's stomach twisted again. He had known Lila for nearly 2 years, and he did believe her. He wanted to believe her, but the mounting evidence couldn't be ignored. His instincts told him that something wasn't right. "I'm sorry, Lila," Greg said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I need to check your bag. I'm sorry, but I have to." Lila's face paled, and her body stiffened at his request. She blinked a few times, as if processing his words, then her lips pressed into a thin line. For a moment, Greg thought she might refuse. Her hesitation stretched out in the quiet kitchen, her fingers fidgeting with the rag in her hand. I don't want to do this, Greg," Lila finally whispered, her voice small. She looked away, then back at him. "But if you need to, then I understand." With a resigned sigh, Lila placed her bag on the counter between them. Her hands trembled slightly as she unzipped it, avoiding Greg's gaze the entire time. She seemed small in that moment. Her usual confidence crumbled in the face of the confrontation. Greg watched her carefully, his heart heavy with uncertainty. He didn't know what he would find, but he had to do this. Greg reached for the bag and slowly unzipped it, his fingers brushing against the familiar fabric. It felt like an invasion of privacy, but he couldn't stop now. As he peered inside, he saw a jumble of items: lip balm, crumpled napkins, a few receipts. Nothing unusual at first glance. But as he dug deeper, he felt a sharp intake of breath. There, nestled at the bottom, were things he had never expected to see. Valuable silver, cutlery, a bottle of olive oil, and what looked like an expensive piece of jewelry wrapped carefully in a cloth. His hands shook as he pulled it out, the delicate chain catching the dim light above them. Greg felt his chest tighten, his pulse racing. The items were undeniably from the restaurant, and there was no explanation for their presence in Lila's bag. But then his fingers brushed something else. An envelope, slightly worn but still sealed. His mind raced and he hesitated, holding it in his hand for a moment before slowly opening it. Inside, the letter was short and unsettling. For your safety, I've sent these along with the rest of your things. I know what's happening to you, and I won't let you be hurt any longer. The money is for you to start fresh. Take it and leave this life behind. Signed only with an initial. Greg's heart sank as he read the letter. There was a story here, a story he hadn't expected. Lila wasn't stealing for the sake of greed. She was being coerced. But by whom? And why? His thoughts swirled, and he looked up at Lila, who was now looking at him, her face pale and tear-streaked. I wasn't stealing, Greg, she said quietly, her voice breaking. I swear I wasn't. I'm being forced into this. The room felt as though it had become smaller, the air heavier with each passing moment. Greg's hands shook slightly as he held the letter, his mind struggling to comprehend the situation. His eyes flickered between the letter and Lila, who stood before him, her shoulders hunched with a mixture of shame and fear. Her hands trembled at her sides, her face a canvas of vulnerability. Everything Greg had suspected about Lila, the quiet worker, the trusted employee, suddenly seemed to crumble beneath the weight of what he had found. The jewelry, the cutlery, the olive oil. These things were undeniably from his restaurant. But the letter, signed with the simple initial M, painted a far different picture than the one Greg had imagined. This wasn't theft driven by greed or carelessness. This was something far more complicated. Lila's face had gone pale as Greg read the letter aloud in his mind. The last thing he expected was to find this kind of note, one that spoke of someone controlling Lila, using her for their own purposes. He couldn't understand why someone would involve Lila in something like this. She had always been so quiet, so reserved, never looking for attention or wealth. So why now? Why would someone force her into stealing? The silence between them felt like a weight Greg couldn't escape. He wanted to ask Lila 100 questions. What was going on? Who was M? Why she had kept this hidden? But the words felt trapped in his throat. He simply stared at her, his mind racing as he tried to process everything. Lila, for her part, didn't seem to want to say anything more. She stood there, almost shrinking into herself, as though she had given all I could. Greg placed the letter carefully on the counter. His fingers lingered over it for a moment before he looked back at Lila. His voice was softer now, no longer filled with accusation, but with concern. Lila. What is this? What's really going on? She hesitated, her gaze lowering to the floor as if she couldn't bear to meet his eyes. Then, after a long silence, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. I didn't want to get anyone involved, Greg, she said. I thought I could handle it, but I don't know what else to do anymore. I've been doing what Em told me to do, taking things, delivering them. All of it. Greg's heart sank. He stepped closer, trying to make sense of it all. But why, Lila? Why didn't you tell me? You know I would have helped. Lila looked up then, her eyes filled with pain and fear. I didn't think anyone could help me. I thought I was in too deep. Em said if I didn't do what they wanted, they'd hurt me. Or worse, hurt my family. I didn't want to bring trouble here. Greg's stomach churned as her words settled in. She wasn't just a thief. She was a victim of some kind of coercion, trapped in a web that she couldn't escape. He couldn't imagine the fear that must have consumed her every day, knowing that someone was controlling her, making her commit these acts. Lila's voice faltered as she continued. "I've been scared, Greg. So scared. And when I saw the way things were going, how everything kept adding up, I froze. I didn't know what to do. I didn't want to lose my job here. But I couldn't. I couldn't keep living." Like this. The pressure was too much. But I didn't know who else to turn to. Greg felt a surge of empathy for Lila. She wasn't a thief. She wasn't a criminal. She was a woman backed into a corner, doing what she thought was necessary to protect herself and her family. But Greg also felt a deep sense of anger. Anger at whoever M was, the person who had taken advantage of Lila's vulnerability and trapped her in this nightmare. He knew this wasn't just about stolen goods. This was about manipulation, fear, and control. He placed a hand on her shoulder, offering a gesture of comfort, even though he felt powerless to truly change the situation. "Lila, you don't have to do this anymore. I believe you. You're not alone. We'll get you help, I promise." Lila nodded slowly, but her face was filled with uncertainty. She looked down at her hands, wringing them nervously, as if she were unsure of what the next step would be. "But what about M? They'll know I told you. What if they come after me, or worse, my family?" Greg took a deep breath. He couldn't guarantee anything, but he knew one thing. He wasn't going to let Lila go through this alone. He would do whatever it took to help her get out of this dangerous situation. "We'll go to the authorities," Greg said, his voice firm. "They can protect you, Lila. We'll make sure you and your family are safe. Whoever M is, they won't be able to control you anymore." The fear in Lila's eyes softened just a little as she met his gaze. She didn't seem entirely convinced, but there was a flicker of hope there. Something Greg hadn't seen before. For the first time, it seemed like she could see a way out of this dark tunnel. As the conversation slowed, Greg could hear the distant hum of the restaurant, the clink of glasses from the dining area. It was strange to think that the world outside was still turning normally, while inside the small kitchen, everything had changed. But Greg knew that this was only the beginning. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, and there was still so much they needed to figure out. For now, though, Greg felt a sense of relief. The truth was out in the open. Lila wasn't the thief he'd once thought. She was a woman trying to survive, and together, they would find a way to help her rebuild her life. The weight of the conversation hung heavy in the air, the silence between Greg and Lila thick with the burden of their unspoken words. Greg's heart ached for her, but he knew this moment was crucial. She had been holding on to this secret for so long, and now for the first time she was letting it all out. She had been trapped, living in fear, and now she was finally free to speak her truth. But even as Greg processed everything she had shared, another unsettling thought gnawed at him. He couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't yet at the full extent of the story. Lila stood before him, her posture still tight with anxiety, her fingers twitching in nervous little movements as she tried to compose herself. The faint scent of detergent clung to the air, a reminder of how ordinary this all seemed on the surface. But the reality was anything but ordinary. Greg could see the pain etched into her face, the kind of pain that came from months of pressure, of being forced into a life she never wanted. As the minutes passed, Greg broke the silence. His voice was quieter now, filled with compassion, but also a deep sense of urgency. Lila, I believe you, but we need to know more. Who is M? What do they want from you? Lila's shoulders slumped as if the question was too much for her to bear. She closed her eyes for a moment, as though summoning the courage to continue. Her voice was barely above a whisper when she spoke again. I don't know much about, not really. They've always been careful, but I know they're dangerous. They know everything about me. My family, where I live. They said if I didn't do what they wanted, they'd hurt my sister. My mom. Lila's voice cracked, the tears threatening to spill once more. I couldn't let that happen. Greg's heart broke as he listened to her words. He knew she was telling the truth. There was no way a person could fake this level of fear and anguish. M had gone to extreme lengths to control her, and now it was all beginning to make sense. Whoever M was, they were not just manipulating her into stealing for their own gain. They were using Lila's love for her family to hold her hostage. Emotionally. Lila, Greg said, his voice low with understanding. I can't imagine what you've been through, but you're not alone anymore. We'll make sure M can't hurt you or your family. Lila shook her head, her eyes clouded with doubt. I don't know, Greg. M is powerful. They have people who'll do anything for them. I thought I could handle it alone, but it's only getting worse. They've been asking for more, bigger things, more expensive things. I was scared to say no. I didn't know what would happen if I did. Greg could see the depth of her fear. She wasn't just scared of the person behind M. She was terrified of what they might do to her family, and that fear had driven her to carry out their demands, no matter how much it weighed on her conscience. He placed a hand gently on her shoulder, trying to reassure her. Lila, listen to me. You did what you had to do to protect them, but now we can stop this. We can bring this to the authorities, and they'll help us. You don't have to carry this burden anymore. Lila's gaze remained locked on the floor as she fought to steady herself. I'm scared, Greg. What if they come after me? What if they hurt someone? I can't take that risk. Greg's mind raced. The danger was real, and it wasn't just about stolen goods. It was about a dangerous person or organization pulling the strings from behind the scenes. Greg understood her fear, but he also knew that staying silent or hiding wouldn't protect her. If they didn't act now, the situation could escalate even further. You can't live like this forever, Lila, Greg said softly. You deserve a life without fear. Your family deserves that too. Lila looked up at him, the rawness in her eyes unmistakable. It was clear she wanted to believe him, to trust that they could fix this. But the shadow of M's threats loomed large in her mind. She had been living in fear for so long, it was hard for her to imagine a different reality. Greg continued, his voice firm but reassuring. We'll get you protection, and we'll find out who M is. But the first step is telling the authorities everything you know. That's the only way to stop this. I promise you, you don't have to do this alone. Lila swallowed hard, her lips trembling as she nodded slowly. Okay, she whispered. I'll do it. I'll tell them everything. A sense of relief washed over Greg as he saw the change in her. The decision to finally speak out, to stop living under the constant threat of M, was a huge step, and he knew it wouldn't be easy. But at least now Lila had a chance. She had a path forward that didn't involve living in constant fear. Greg made a silent vow in that moment. He wouldn't let Lila down. Whatever it took, he would help her find the justice she deserved. As the reality of the situation began to sink in, Greg also knew this wasn't just about one woman's struggle. It was about a much larger problem, one that stretched beyond the walls of his small bistro. "I'm going to make some calls," Greg said as he stood up. "We'll get the ball rolling right now. You don't have to go through this anymore." Lila's eyes softened with gratitude, but also with exhaustion. She had been carrying this secret for so long, and now she could finally release it. It wasn't going to be easy, but with Greg's help, she was no longer alone. Together, they would bring M to light, and Lila would be free from the invisible chains that had bound her for so long. And maybe, just maybe, she could begin to rebuild her life, without fear, and with the hope that things could finally get better. The following days were a whirlwind of activity for Greg and Lila. The weight of what they had uncovered, the full scope, of the danger Lila had been living under, was overwhelming. Lila had finally agreed to go to the authorities, to tell them everything she knew about M and the twisted hold they had over her. But as they began to prepare for what would undoubtedly be a difficult process, the reality of what lay ahead started to sink in. There was no easy way out of this, and Lila wasn't sure where the road would take her. Greg had made a promise to her that he would be there every step of the way. He couldn't help but feel both a sense of relief and fear. Relief that Lila was finally taking control of her life again, but fear for what she might have to face. The journey ahead would be long and treacherous. M was still out there, and Greg knew they couldn't be sure of who they were up against or what lengths they would go to in order to keep their secrets safe. On a quiet evening, just before the authorities were to be called in, Lila found herself standing outside the bistro, gazing out at the city. The streets were empty, bathed in the soft glow of the streetlights. It was the first time in weeks that she felt somewhat at peace, but the uncertainty of the future loomed large. She felt torn between the need for safety and the fear of retaliation. Would M come after her? Was her family truly safe? She didn't know what would happen, but she was trying to trust Greg, trying to believe that they could stop this. Greg joined her on the sidewalk, leaning against the brick wall of the bistro. He could sense the tension in the air, and it mirrored his own feelings. He had promised to protect her, but part of him feared that the person or group behind him would prove to be far more dangerous than they had imagined. The unknown was always the hardest part. What if the authorities couldn't offer the protection she needed? What if the situation escalated beyond their control? "You don't have to do this alone, Lila," Greg said gently, breaking the silence. His voice was calm, but the concern was evident in his eyes. He watched her, waiting for her to respond. Lila took a deep breath, her face reflecting the inner conflict she had been carrying. "I know, Greg, but it's hard. I've lived in fear for so long, and now I'm about to bring all of this to light. I'm scared of what will happen to me and to my family. What if M comes after us? What if I've made everything worse?" Greg placed a hand on her shoulder, his touch reassuring. "We can't live in fear forever, Lila. This isn't just about you anymore. It's about stopping whoever M is from hurting anyone else? And you've already shown a lot of courage by coming forward. You're not alone, I promise you. Lila nodded slowly, feeling the weight of his words. The fear was still there, gnawing at her insides, but it wasn't as overwhelming as it had been. For the first time in months, she could see a way out. She was no longer just a pawn in M's game. She was taking back control of her life, and that was something she never thought she'd be able to do. The decision to go to the authorities wasn't easy, but Lila knew it was the right one. She had to face her fears no matter how daunting they seemed. The truth would set her free, but it was also going to be the hardest thing she had ever done, They walked back into the bistro. Greg looked at Lila with a sense of admiration. He knew it had taken everything in her to get to this point, and now he had to follow through on his promise to help her. "We'll take it one step at a time," Greg said, his voice steady and reassuring. "I'll make sure you're safe, and together we'll bring M to justice." Lila gave him a small smile, though her eyes were still clouded with uncertainty. "Thank you, Greg. I don't know what I would have done without you, but I still don't know what happens next. What if it's not over, even after we tell the authorities? What if M still has people who will come after us?" Greg's gaze softened. He had thought about that too. He knew that this wasn't just about bringing the person behind M to justice. It was about securing Lila's future. There would be no quick fix to the situation, and the consequences of confronting M could be far-reaching. But Greg also knew one thing. Lila couldn't keep living in fear, and neither could he. They had to take action, even if the road ahead was unclear and dangerous. "We'll figure it out, Lila," Greg said, his voice firm and full of determination. "You've already taken the hardest step, and now we'll take the next one, together." The ball. Two of them sat down at one of the empty tables in the restaurant, their minds racing with the weight of the decision that was about to unfold. The phone call to the authorities would happen in the morning. They would tell everything they knew, and from there, the truth would be out in the open. But Greg couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The road ahead would be filled with obstacles, and they would have to be prepared for whatever came their way. Lila took a deep breath, steadying herself for the journey ahead. "I'm ready, Greg," she said softly. "It's time to stop hiding." Greg nodded, knowing that the most difficult part of the journey was still to come. But in that moment, as he looked at Lila, stronger than she had been in months, he felt a sense of hope. No matter what M had planned, Greg and Lila would face it together. And that, he knew, would be enough. The days that followed were filled with a mixture of anxiety and determination. Greg and Lila had taken the first steps toward uncovering the truth, but now they were in uncharted territory. They had gone to the authorities, and though the process was long and grueling, there was a sense of relief in knowing that the truth was no longer locked away in the darkness. Lila had taken control of her own fate, and that alone was a victory. Yet, as they waited for the investigation to unfold, the fear still lingered. M was out there, somewhere, and they didn't know what lengths they would go to in order to silence her. Greg had promised Lila that they would face this together, and he wasn't about to break that promise. Every day he checked in with her, offering reassurance when her doubts crept back in. The fear of retaliation from M had not dissipated. Lila's mind often wandered to the possibility that M would find a way to get to her or her family. Greg couldn't offer any guarantees, but he could be there for her, each step of the way. It had been a week since they had made the decision to go public with the truth. The authorities had begun their investigation, but so far there was no solid lead on who M really was. The letter Lila had found in her bag, the one signed with the cryptic initial M, remained a mystery. Every time they tried to trace it, they hit dead ends. M had covered their tracks well, and they had apparently operated in the shadows for a long time. But Greg knew that this was only the beginning. One quiet evening, Lila found herself sitting at the counter of the bistro, wiping down the countertops. The restaurant was quiet, its usual bustle replaced by the stillness of an uncertain future. For the first time in weeks, Lila felt like she could breathe a little easier. She still carried the weight of the situation with her, but it was no longer suffocating. There was a sense of agency within her, something she hadn't had for a long time. Greg walked in from the back office, his face tired but determined. He had just come back from a meeting with the authorities, where he had learned that they were making progress. They had uncovered some details about M, though it wasn't enough to make an arrest yet. The investigation was still ongoing, but, for the first time, there was hope that they might get to the bottom of it. "We're getting closer," Greg said as he approached the counter, his voice filled with both optimism and caution. "They've tracked down some leads and they're working on it. But we need to stay vigilant. This isn't over yet." Lila nodded, her fingers still moving absently over the counter. "I know," she said softly, though there was a trace of calm in her voice that hadn't been there before. "But I think I'm ready now, ready to move forward. No more living in fear." Greg smiled gently, his heart swelling with pride at the strength he saw in her. "You're stronger than you know, Lila. You've come so far already. I'm proud of you." Lila met his gaze, and for the first time, a true sense of relief washed over her. It wasn't just about the investigation or the possibility of M being caught. It was about her reclaiming her life. The decisions she had made over the past few weeks, confronting her fears, opening up to the authorities, and accepting help, had given her a sense of agency that she had never felt before. She was no longer just a victim of circumstance. She was taking charge of her own future. "I don't know what's going to happen next," Lila admitted, her voice quiet but steady. "But I don't want to live in fear anymore. I want to live my life the way I'm supposed to." Greg nodded, his heart full. "And you will. You'll find your way. It's going to take time, but I'll be here to help you every step of the way." As the evening continued, Lila felt a weight lifting off her shoulders. The uncertainty of what the future held was still there, but it was no longer a constant shadow over her life. The fear of retaliation from M had not completely disappeared, but she was no longer allowing it to control her every decision. For the first time in a long time, she was taking steps toward building a future for herself that wasn't dominated by fear and manipulation. In the days that followed, Greg continued to support Lila, offering reassurance and guidance as they both navigated the aftermath of the investigation. The authorities had made some arrests related to the smuggling ring that M had been involved in, but the full picture was still unfolding. Greg and Lila knew that there was still more work to be done, but it felt different now. They weren't alone in this fight anymore. Lila's confidence grew with each passing day. She returned to work at the bistro, but this time it felt different. The kitchen, once a place where she had been trapped by fear and guilt, became a symbol of her strength. She was no longer just the dishwasher, hiding from the truth. She was a woman reclaiming her dignity and her future. Every task she completed felt like a small victory, each one bringing her closer to the life she wanted to build. As the weeks turned into months, the investigation continued to progress, and M's network slowly unraveled. The authorities were closing in, and Lila's testimony had played a pivotal role in bringing down the operation. She never imagined that she could make a difference, but now she knew that her voice mattered. She had fought for herself, for her family, and for her future, and she had won. One evening, after a particularly busy shift, Greg and Lila sat together in the empty restaurant. They shared a quiet meal, the soft hum of the fridge in the background, the warmth of the kitchen light casting a peaceful glow. Lila looked across the table at Greg, her face relaxed, the worry lines that had once plagued her expression slowly fading away. "Thank you, Greg," Lila said softly, her voice filled with gratitude. "For everything. I don't think I could have done this without you." Greg smiled, his heart full. "You did it, Lila. You found your strength. You were the one who chose to take back control. I'm just glad I could be here to help." As the night stretched on, Lila felt a sense of peace settle within her. The future was uncertain, and there would be challenges ahead. But for the first time in a long time, she felt ready to face them. She was no longer living in fear. She was living in possibility. And with the support of those who cared about her, she knew that anything was possible.